Thanks everyone for coming to today's webinar, Speaking Fast and Slow, Assessing Speaking in the Primary Classroom.
While you're doing that, Matt, I just want to say hello and welcome everybody. Hope you get a chance to fill out the attendance form. We're super happy to have you with us. And my name is Mary Scholl, and I am the Executive Director at the Institute for Collaborative Learning. And together we also have with us Ivan Suazo. Ivan, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. I see familiar faces, and thank you for turning your cameras on. That's great to see your faces and your names also. I will be here supporting you. Any technical area or questions or requests you have, we'll be sharing some resources, attendance and feedback forms. So in case you need or the link of the session, also the Zoom link. So I'll be sharing in the chat. And if you have any question, I'll be here to support you in any ways. So thank you for coming. Thank you. Pass over to you, Mary.
Oh, thanks. Matt, how you doing?
I am all ready to go.
Okay.
I realized
pass it off to Matt.
Thanks. To let you all so look forward to that. And right now we'd like to share some words of welcome from Elizabeth Smith, the Cultural Affairs Officer of the U.S. Embassy in San Jose.
Hola a todos. My name is Elizabeth Smith, and I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica. I'm delighted to welcome you to this series of webinars made possible through the dedicated efforts of the experienced educators at the Institute for Collaborative Learning, the Ministry of Public Education, and the U.S. Embassy. Teaching English is both a rewarding and challenging task, requiring continuous growth, adaptation, and learning. These webinars will serve as a valuable platform to expand your knowledge, exchange ideas, and explore new, innovative methodologies. Together, you will reach new levels in your teaching practice and inspire your students to excel in English. I encourage you all to actively engage, to participate wholeheartedly, and to share your own experiences and perspectives. By collaborating with one another, you can build a vibrant network of English teachers in Costa Rica, united by a common goal to inspire your students and shape their futures through the power of language. I cannot thank you enough for your hard work and dedication to your profession. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica, I welcome you again, and may this series of webinars be a productive and interesting experience for you. Buena suerte en su proceso de aprendizaje. Adelante.
Matt, we have Randall Centeno with us, and one of our national advisors. I would love to offer the floor to him. Welcome, Randall.
Hello, Mary, Matt, and Ivan. It's good to see you today. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to say thank you very much to the U.S. Embassy also. And thank you very much to all the teachers that are participating in this activity today. In the previous activity, we learned about different strategies that we can use to develop oral skills in our classrooms. And now, obviously, it's very necessary to learn about the different strategies that we can use to assess those oral skills. So, as usual, I just want to say thank you very much for being part of this activity, and I hope you enjoy it and that you learn a lot so that you can put it into practice into your classes.
Thank you so much, Randall. Thank you for joining us. And we have 457 devices connected today. That's amazing. That's wonderful. So thank you so much. Yeah. And again, our gratitude to the U.S. Embassy and our gratitude to the national advisors for all your support and work, and the regional advisors for all your support and work. And big gratitude to all the teachers that are here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you get some ideas that you can take back and try out soon, and ideas that you can also take and adapt for your circumstances. So Matt's been working hard on getting this ready. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Randall and Mary. Thanks for helping create, and Ivan for helping create these opportunities. I'm also thankful for the familiar faces I'm seeing out there. I know a lot of you have been coming to the other webinars in our series of trainings this year, so thanks for consistently coming out. If any of you have missed any of our prior webinars, you can see here of the 2 primary focused webinars and the 3 webinars for all MEP teachers. 2 of those webinars are complete, and you'll be able to find recordings on our resource website soon. So if you missed those webinars and want to watch them asynchronously, you can still watch the video, fill out an asynchronous attendance form, and let us, MEP, and the embassy know that you still wanted that training, even if you were busy those days. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt. I'm excited to talk to you today. I've been working teaching English in the ESL space for over 10 years now. And whenever I'm listing off things in my resume, I always start with that. I always start with being a classroom teacher. I think it's really important. I feel like the more I get into designing materials, the more important it is that I have one foot in the classroom, that I'm always doing at least one thing that is me with students who are learning English, right? I want to stay fresh, and I want to make sure I remember what that challenge is like, what working with a class who might not even be able to understand the instructions of an activity looks like, and make sure that if I'm designing or trainings or resources or suggesting ideas, that I'm trying them out myself and seeing, does this stuff really work? So today we're talking about speaking fast and slow. I want to think about how we assess learning and when we assess learning. When are we assessing our students slow speaking? When are we getting our students speaking fast and assessing that kind of speaking as well? I also want to think, how can we assess moments in a very slow, methodical way? Let's say it's the end of the year, we need to do a summative assessment on a student's speaking, and we really need a final grade that's representative of their learning, right? How do we design a slow, thoughtful process for that important summative assessment? And how do I design a really fast assessment? I know that one of the challenges of teaching primary school is you've got a room full of tiny human beings, and they're very quick and they can be very mischievous. So I know anything that I suggest to you today, we need to be able to do it quickly, right? I know as a teacher, you don't always just get 10 minutes to sit at your desk and fill out a form, right? Even me saying, oh yeah, and then you just sit at your desk for 5 minutes and take notes. 5 minutes might be more time than your students allow you to have apart from them. So I also want to think about assessment strategies that fit into your day as working teachers. So I hope by the end of today, we've got assessment strategies and ideas that are fast and slow so that we can assess our students speaking that's both fast and slow. So let's get into it. I also want to shout out the title of this webinar because it pushed my grammar knowledge a little bit deeper. As I was making the slides, I asked myself, should it be speaking quickly and slowly, speaking slowly and quickly, speaking fastly? Fastly is not a word. Turns out you can use fast and slow as adverbs in that spot. So you can use quickly, you can use quick. I learned that. So wanted to share that with all of y'all too. Here's a little overview of what we'll be talking about today. We're going to start with a discussion and do a little community building by sharing ideas about how and when we're assessing learning, and thinking about how and when we assess learning connects to those spaces of learning and the spaces of assessment we're creating. A little bit of the topic from the last webinar. So if you missed it, you'll get a little review. And if you were here, we'll think about how we can apply that to assessment. I also want to think a little bit with you all about seeing assessment metaphorically. I know one of the skills you all have is creativity. You make beautiful posters and think up new activities to keep your students engaged and motivated. So I want to activate our creative brains and see what's a metaphor we might create for what assessment in our preschool classrooms is like. I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of assessment, right? If I'm going to squeeze something into my busy day as a teacher, I need to have a reason to do it. There's not enough time for all the important stuff. And so I've got to make sure that what I'm doing has a clear purpose and it's worth the time that it takes to do. So I want to think about what are the different purposes of assessment so that when I choose to do an assessment activity or you choose to make an activity an accessible moment, you and I are doing it with a clear purpose that's serving learning. Finally, I want to share with you an idea that we've experimented with at the Institute for Collaborative Learning about a formative and summative hybrid assessment. I think a lot of times these assessment webinars are a list of different categories that all feel very separated. But like I was just telling you, I've found a lot of success in the creative space when ideas start getting mixed together. So I want to show you how we mixed together some formative and summative assessment to serve institutional needs while also serving our learners and their learning. And after we talk about all that, and think about also how eCRIF and assessment fit together, where the different accessible moments in our lesson are, we'll see what questions you have. Thank you again so much for being here. I hope you all find your way to the chat, click on that link, and take 5 minutes to fill out the attendance form. It's so wonderful to have so many of you here. We're almost at 500. Woohoo! Alrighty, so let's get started with an opening discussion. I want to share with you all an opportunity to think together about the topic that we're talking about. So, what is the difference between speaking fast and speaking slow? I want you to think about yourselves and when you're speaking, either in English, Spanish, Bribri, or any other language you might speak. When and where do you speak fast? When and where do you speak slow? When I read these questions, one of the first things that comes to my mind is who, right? I can think of people I speak really quickly around, right? When I'm with Rolando is sharing in chat when he's with friends, he speaks fast. I feel that. When I'm with my friends, or if I'm with my brothers, we'll get speaking quick, right? We know a lot of the same things, and so we use shortcuts and talk very quick like that. Carla shares in chat that in that teaching moment, she switches into teacher voice. Okay, students, right? I had to really learn which classrooms could take my full California English and which classrooms needed a bigger mix of teacher English too. Maria adds while giving instructions. So there might be specific moments in the class where I as a teacher need to speak really slowly. Susie adds that emotion plays a role, right? Sometimes if someone's feeling nervous, it might make you speak faster as well. So it's mixed with audience, context, emotion, a little amount of repetition. Maritza adds that something being spontaneous might lead towards speaking more quickly, right? If I don't know exactly what I'm going to say, I'm kind of jumping from word to word. And I know the moment I stop talking, the moment you start talking. So I need to keep talking or else I give up the mic, right? So I might keep talking a little bit more to find my idea if we're speaking in a spontaneous way. Whereas if I'm saying something planned, right? If I'm reading a speech at a very formal event and it's something I've tried to memorize, I don't find myself speaking as quickly. Right? Caroline adds that in conversations or games that oftentimes, right, when we have some kind of other purpose. The way I've been thinking about this that I think has space for a lot of what we're sharing is, I think when accuracy is important with the words that I say and the message being heard, that's when I speak slowly. If I'm giving instructions to the students and accuracy is really important, right? I need to know that they're in a group of 3 people for 4 minutes, not 4 people for 3 minutes, right? Accuracy is really important in that moment. So if myself as the communicator, if I know that my message being communicated very accurately is very important, that's when I'm going to speak slow, right? Another moment I can think of is if you've got an air traffic controller talking to the pilot of an airplane. Hello, Cessna C5725. I'm going to need you to take one more pass around Juan Santa Maria International Airport. Your flight arrival time has been bumped back 5 minutes. Repeat, 5 minutes. That's a moment where accuracy is really important, right? If that pilot misunderstands information because they were speaking too fast and 2 planes come in at the same time, that could be a huge catastrophe, right? So when accuracy is the most important thing going on, we speak slowly, right? Or if I'm giving someone instructions, like let's say I have an old car and you have to, oh, this is true. I have a 20-year-old car in the garage right now and everything's a little bit broken. but if you wiggle the key just right, it comes open. So if I'm going to lend my car to a friend, I'm going to speak slowly and explain very accurately what they need to do to open the car. Now, on the opposite side of things, when I'm excited, when I'm really engaged in a moment, or if I have some other purpose, that's when I start speaking quickly, right? If I'm racing to the supermarket to buy food before I run home to get ready to go to a party, well, I'm at the supermarket speaking really fast. Okay, thanks. Yep, here's my credit card. Yep, thank you very much. Okay, bye. Right? My mind is on something else. I'm more concerned with the fluency, with the speed of what's going on, right? So I think thinking about this is really helpful for me, because then as a teacher, I can design moments and say, this is a moment when I want my student to speak slowly. I want them to speak slowly and accurately, and I'm going to be assessing their slow, accurate speaking, right? So I can design a slow moment and then assess the accuracy that comes up in that type of slow speaking. Or alternatively, if I want to assess my students' fluency, I want to assess their ability to speak quickly with few pauses, I need to create a game or a role play or some personal conversation that gets them really excited. That's when I'm going to hear them speaking the fastest they can in English. That's when I'm going to hear their most fluency. So when I think about those contexts from my own life, it helps me design classroom activities that guide students towards these two different kinds of speaking so that I can assess both types of speaking. Remember, last webinar, we said that productive speaking requires a good level of accuracy and a good level of fluency. So I want to make sure I can guide students to develop both and then assess how my students are developing both of those skills. A quick reminder, last webinar, we talked about these three spaces of learning. Thinking about how in our classroom, we have some moments that are like being on a stage, some moments that are like being around a coffee table, and some moments that are like being in the studio, right? When one student comes to the front of the classroom to present an idea, or I call on a student at the back of the room and everyone looks at them, I've created a stage moment in the classroom. Some of my students will shine in that space and some might not. If I put students in small groups or give them a partner task, I might create a coffee table-like vibe that really lets students who have that interpersonal flair shine. And if I give students individual projects or some kind of homework, that might give them time to do some speaking in the studio. Well, thinking about how students might have preferences towards these. Again, I think about these as preferences. I know my preference is the stage, but I also can do productive work in the coffee table and at the studio. It just, if I had to choose one of the three, I'd lean towards the stage. Well, knowing that these are preferences, I'm curious, what kind of space do you feel like you usually assess your students in? Do you feel like when you're assessing your students speaking, it's usually like a stage? Are you usually having your students come to the room one at a time and calling on them to speak there, or calling into the back of the room? Is the stage usually how you assess? Do you usually have students work in small groups and then listen into their small group conversations and assess them there? Or is most of your assessment studio assessment? You have the students work individually on a project and share what they're working on, like sending a video or doing something like that. Where do you usually assess your students? Gabby shares in chat that the stage is where she usually assesses students. I know when I was learning Spanish, that's what it was, right? When Mrs. Winchell needed to assess our Spanish, yo fui al frente de la aula para decir, hola, me llamo Esmat y yo soy de California. ¿De dónde eres usted? And my partner would say, hola, yo soy Logan. Yo también soy de California. Usted like, and that would be our assessment. And then we'd sit down, we'd get our points, and that'd be that. I'm seeing a lot of teachers share that that is the most common answer, right? Most often, the assessment of learning happens on the stage. I'd say the next most common answer is teachers saying they use all three, which is nice. I like thinking about that balance there. My high school Spanish, it was probably that bad. It might have been worse. I'm making no claims that I could speak that fluently in Spanish. I was not a great student in the Spanish classroom back then. I didn't think I had a lot of purpose. Now I do. So I think I usually assess students around the coffee table, right? Again, I know my preference is for the stage. And so I try really hard to make sure that I'm not creating too many stage moments in the classroom. Just because I know I like the stage, I don't want to force students to go on the stage if that's someplace they're not comfortable. And I know if I always assess learning on stage, if the only time I'm giving students points for speaking, they're in the front of the classroom, some of my students are going to have low speaking scores because of their emotional response, because they're embarrassed or shy, right? My student who's really conscious about their body and the way they look, they're going to have less points for speaking because of something completely unrelated to language, right? Something emotional and personal they're dealing with is now affecting their speaking grade if every accessible moment is up on stage. And I think there's challenges like that if we lean too heavily into one of these moments just for assessment. I really think this is an important checklist for us to say, as I'm assessing this skill or this topic, do I have at least two different spaces in which my students could show me, right? Because again, I know some of my students shine on stage. Some of my students want to come to the front of the classroom and share with their peers. So I'm not saying don't do that, right? Let the students who shine on stage have a stage. That's going to help them learn. But I'm asking the question.
Hoy no, estoy en una capacitación hasta mañana. Por eso le puse mañana.
Share an answer with you by the end. How could we create options so that students have different pathways and they can show us their learning in a space that's comfortable for them? I think we're going to skip on past this. We might come back at the end if we have time. One of the stage moments that I'm thinking about, or I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is if I'm going to call one student to the front of the classroom or a pair of students or a small group, what are all of the other students doing so that they're actively engaged? I think on the one hand, the stage is nice because that moment feels like it's a little bit more manageable in terms of classroom management. Everyone is silent, 3 students talk. The classroom is quiet. No talking. You may begin. I can give very stern instructions and guide behavior, and hopefully students obey. But one of the things that I think is key to getting an audience to actually listen is they need a reason to listen. If they're just watching their peers perform, but they don't have any specific listening task, every group is going to be quietly practicing and not listening. And that to me doesn't feel like a super effective use of everyone's time. Now the students on stage don't really have a stage because the audience isn't paying attention to them. And the audience isn't getting any chance to listen or get supported before they perform because they're just talking and ignoring what's going on. So if I'm going to bring students up onto stage, I'm going to give the audience a specific listening task, okay? I'm going to say, all right, you're going to watch David's group do a role play about the supermarket. I want everyone to make a list in your head. What are 3 different things that David's group purchases at the supermarket? So I need to give a specific task to the audience. That's going to help the students not on stage be engaged, and the students on stage feel like they have an audience. In terms of gathering around a coffee table, one of the things I'm thinking about is if I arrange my students into many small coffee tables, I can observe and assess one group, have students change the roles, and then observe and assess another group. I know one of the polls towards having students come up on stage is if only one group of students presents at a time, then I, the teacher, get a chance to listen to every single group. And I can write down a number in their grade book, which is something I have to do. I have to write down a grade. And so the stage might help me with the logistical challenge of when am I going to find time to write the score in the grade book, right? To actually make the observation and grade it. Now, this to me is a strategy that could bring that logistic challenge around the coffee table. Maybe instead of just having my students do a role play once, I could say, all right, you're going to do a role play where you're a parent, a child, and an employee at a supermarket. And you have to look around, find some food, and purchase at least 5 different things. And the students do it once with one of the roles, and then they rotate and do it again with a different role. And then they rotate and do it again with a third role. And each of those 3 rotations, I can be listening to a different 1 or 2 groups, so that over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, the students do 15 minutes of constant speaking. And I'm just dipping in and assessing 1 or 2 groups at a time. This might also let me start with my students who I know are at the higher end of the class, who need a little bit less practice to be ready, and then rotate around the room. And by the time I get to the last group, who maybe has some of my lower level students, they've had a chance to practice the conversation twice already with no teacher there. So this rotation might also help me create a differentiated experience where lower level students get more opportunities to practice. Finally, in terms of creating a studio, one of the things I'm thinking about is there's a lot of cool technology opportunities that can let me bring speaking from the home or the studio into the classroom. Students can record a video, they can send an audio message on WhatsApp, they can create dialogues on Flipgrids or use other kinds of applications to share their speaking. But for me, one of the challenges that I'm thinking about with assessing in the studio is if I'm getting students to do speaking in the studio, how am I making sure that they're speaking spontaneously, right? Because what I'm trying to assess at sometimes is their fluent speech. And one of the ideas we shared a lot last webinar was if a student creates a script and they're trying to reproduce language from their memory, they're not speaking fluently, right? They're speaking from memory, but they're really just repeating sounds. The same way I can say, "Okarimashita," okay? Which is a sentence in Japanese and does mean, yes, I understand. But I don't actually speak Japanese. I just know how to repeat or regurgitate that information. I'm like a parrot with that. And so that's what I really think about with studio listening challenges. How do I make sure to say, I want you to record the whole thing in one live take? And if you end up recording multiple versions, I only want you to record it a maximum of 3 times. Or what are the other things I can say to make sure, right? Hey, I want to make sure that in your role play video, I see you looking straight at another person and not looking at a script that's on the screen, right? If I can see your eyes reading off of a script, I'm not going to give you points for the assignment. You're going to have to do it again, right? How am I going to make sure that if I move speaking assessment into the studio so that my students who shine in the studio can shine, that I also make sure I'm giving them a chance to shine speaking fluently and not just repeating memorized speeches. Alrighty, another moment where I'd like to activate your creativity and share some thoughts. I want you to think of a metaphor or a simile. Think about assessing students in your primary school classrooms. What would you compare assessing those students to? Is it like fishing or mountain biking? Is it like looking for just the right shirt in a department store? Or is it like trying to juggle? I don't know, let me know in the chat or feel free to unmute and share your ideas out loud. What is a metaphor for you that you'd compare assessment to and why, if you'd like to share? Jenny in chat shares that assessment is like hiking. I like thinking about how hiking is a journey, right? And when I'm planning a hike, I'm planning what am I going to do at the start, at the middle, at the end? right? I'm planning to stop and take breaks and see how things are going. And so with that same concept, assessment might be a process that I need to plan moments throughout, right? Along this trail of assessment. Cool metaphor, Jenny. I like that with fishing, I know the fish are down there, right? I can't see exactly where they are. So there's a part of it where it's like, as a fisherman, I'm trying to get in the right situation for the fish to come out. I need to go at the right time of day. I need to be quiet. I need to be patient. And then I also need to give the fish time, right? That piece of it seems really important. And I like how that cut flips back on assessment. Your Lenny thinks about travel and how assessment is like planning a trip. Yeah, I think there's like a lot of challenging work ahead of time to get some really exciting moments during. I think travel is a nice metaphor thinking about there. Gabby connects with that too. Maura shares like a concert, sometimes calm, sometimes crazy. I like that, Maura. I think that connects back to our last topic of the spaces of learning. And thinking also how that loud, crazy environment might be the kind of space where some of our students shine. And some students might be overwhelmed by that kind of environment. And so also having that diverse space around assessment can also give different moments for different students to shine as well. Ooh, planning a picnic, that's fun. Paragliding. You jump to unknown place, you never know how your students will react. I like that though, Sylvia. I think if I'm doing something and I'm not exactly sure how my students are going to react, well, that sounds like something I'm doing with curiosity. If I'm doing an activity and saying, I wonder if my students can do this, I wonder which of my students can do this successfully and which of them cannot. If I don't know the answer to that question, that's an assessment question worth asking, right? That's something I might want to find out as a teacher. So I feel like recognizing a moment where I say, I don't know if my students can do this. That's something I want to lean into in the field of assessment. That is assessment, right? It's asking a question and then giving your students a moment to answer that question, right? Asking them the question, can you have a conversation at a supermarket? And then giving them an activity where they have a role play and they try and demonstrate that skill. Here's the metaphor I came.
Hey, Matt, can you unmute? I had to mute
Hi.
everybody.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
I had somebody who I couldn't mute, so I muted everybody.
All right.
So sorry about that.
That's all right. Like we said, sometimes things get a little loud and chaotic, and sometimes we need them to just be quiet and calm. Well, I think observing learning in the preschool class, or sorry, that's supposed to say primary school classroom. I did change this slide. My primary school or my preschool metaphor is like bird watching. And I think you'll see in just a second where I see the difference between elementary school and primary school. So if any of you teach on two different sides of that realm, this slide isn't a repeat. It's actually slightly different. So I think observing learning in the primary classroom is like watching turtles hatch. You know how there's that beach? I can't remember the name. I've gone there twice, never seen a turtle, right? But I know every year around October, feel free to share the name of the beach in chat if you know what I'm talking about. I'm sure someone lives a 5-minute drive from there. So let's hear it. It's like PHNO. So yes, Ostional. That's where I've been twice and yet to see a turtle. Thank you, Gravine. Thank you, Betty. I'm glad I could elicit that from you all. So you can go to Ostional, right? I know the time of year. I need to know how to go there to not disrupt the turtles and ruin the ecosystem. I got to know where to look. That park is pretty down a dirt road. Like you got to have pretty big car to get over those last few sandy bumps. I need to know where to look. And then I also need a little bit of luck and patience, right? Because even though I know this happens in a particular season, I don't know exactly what day it's going to happen on, right? Just like I know if I start teaching students for a year, by the end of that year, they're going to be able to do this, this, and this. Now, I don't know on exactly which day they're going to accomplish those 3 skills. Some of my students might accomplish it a month before the end of school. Some of my students might accomplish those skills the last day of school. Some of my students might just be slow little turtles, and they're just working in their own process of learning at their own pace, and they're not going to accomplish it until 10 days into the next school year. So that's what I'm really thinking about, how a lot of times we can predict that if I do this process of activities over this time with this kind of repetition, eventually students will learn, right? Eventually the turtles will hatch. But I also need to go into this with patience and knowing there's some luck to it. Just like that fishing metaphor too, right? Just because I plan assessment day to be on Friday doesn't mean that every student is going to have finished the process by exactly that Friday. So to me, that folds back into the question, how can I start assessing over time? In the same way that I see a hike being over time, how can I make the process of assessment not just a single moment at the end, but an ongoing journey so that as each different student hatches into their new learning, that I can be there to observe all of those moments. Now, I want to dive into some of the nuts and bolts of assessments. Here I'm saying, if you know how to look, where to look, when to look, and what you're looking for, you'll find it. Now I want to think about assessing speaking. How do we assess speaking? Where do we assess speaking? When do we assess speaking? And what exactly do we do to assess speaking? I think if we can put those pieces together, we can figure out how to see what we're looking for. The where really is the topic we were just talking about, right? The stage, the copy table, the studio. Where am I putting learning, right? If I'm only putting learning in one of those spaces and I'm never seeing any of my students speak or hearing that, maybe I'm just needing to give them a slightly different beach to hatch their learning onto, right? I need to just make that space a little bit different. All right, now let's go on to that why part of the question, the purpose of assessment. I have a couple multiple choice questions because I think these terms might be some things some of you are familiar with. So I want to activate that prior knowledge and also get any of you for whom these terms are new to start thinking about them. This is a little assessment moment for me as well. So the first term I'd like you to think about is formative assessment. When you hear the term formative assessment, which of these three definitions connects to you with that term? Is formative assessment before learning to set a mark of where students begin? Is it formal or informal assessment during the process of learning? Or is it formal or informal assessment after learning to measure the experience? I am agreeing with the most of you. When I think of formative assessment, I think that it can be either formal or informal, and it's this ongoing process of learning. No, formal or informal for me is, do the students know I'm assessing? If I give the students a quiz, they know I'm assessing them. That's a formal assessment. If I say, come to the front of the class for oral presentations, they know I'm assessing them. Those are formal assessments. If my students are talking to each other and I'm pretending to clean the class while I'm actually listening and saying, who can have the conversation? And I'm just making a list in my head, that's informal observation, an informal assessment. And if I'm doing that along the way as we're learning a topic, I'm assessing formatively. How about summative assessment? Which of these three answers is summative assessment? I'm going to write question 2 in chat. And I want you to let me know which of these definitions sounds like summative assessment to you. Same 3 options, but a different key term. Most of you have answered C. A few people are answering B and C. If I told you you could choose more than one letter, would you want to choose more than one letter? So when I think of summative assessment, the first thing that comes to my mind is like summation, adding, right? Summative assessment is the result of all of the learning adding together, right? It's what comes at the end. It's the answer, right? So part of summative assessment is definitely C, right? Formal or informal assessment after learning to measure progress. Now, let me give you an example. I recently started a new diet. My partner and I have been eating a very low carb diet, almost no carbs, but I cheat sometimes. And I now weigh 155 pounds. Do you think my diet's working? I've told you that I went through a process of a diet. I've given you the measure at the end of my process. And he says, no. Are you judging me based on how I look? I know I have more to go. So don't worry, the diet's not over. Ingrid says, in order to measure progress, you have to know where you started. If I don't tell you what my starting weight was, then you're not going to be able to figure out if the way I'm eating is helping me lose or gain weight, right? We need at least 2 points of measurement to measure change. So when I think about summative assessment, I think it's a pairing of two things. On the one hand, I need to do some kind of formal or informal assessment at the end of the process of learning to say, how much did we learn? I also need to find some moment near some kind of beginning to take a starting measurement, right? Maybe at the beginning of the class, I show students 5 cards and say, which of these words do you know? What is this? What is this? And I say, wow, nobody knew these 3 words. Johan knew this word, and half of the class knew this word. When I do that at the start of the class, and then I do it again at the end of the class, and I see, wow, now everyone can say this word, not just Johan. Now I can really measure what the progress was over the course of that class. Yeah, and so Andrea, we do need to assess in all the moments. So I think our overall assessment picture needs to include some moments of formative assessment, some moments of summative assessment, some formal observation, and some informal observation. Just like how we're trying to create a really diverse learning experience that's differentiated for different learners, we want to create a really diverse assessment portfolio so that we're making sure that we're observing all of these different things. Okay, so officially the term trabajo cotidiano is done at the end of the experience. So that would be like the official formative assessment, right? Or sorry, official summative assessment. Yeah. And then what I'm saying is sometimes I like to do a similar activity at the beginning of the unit or the beginning of the week and say, where were students at the beginning of the week with this task? But then I give them points just for participation, right? I'm not giving them points based on their correctness. Everyone who tries the activity gets 5 points. But then at the end of the week, I repeat the same activity. That's my trabajo cotidiano. Yeah, we're getting there. And so that's the official grade that I'm submitting. But by doing it once at the beginning and once at the end, I, as the teacher, get to measure what impact did my support as a teacher have, right? And I also get students to have a moment to see, wow, 2 weeks ago, I couldn't do this. Today I can. Alrighty, so the next 2 things I want to think about are assessment for learning and assessment of learning. These are both things that we want to bring into our assessment portfolio. Some of the assessment I do, I want it to be assessment for learning. I want it to be assessment that's going to help myself and help the students know how are they doing and where should they go next, right? Assessment that's for learning, that's going to help. And some of the assessment I do, I want it to be assessment of learning, measuring how much we did learn. That's going to help me report progress when my learning classroom is a part of a broader institution, like a system of education. So take a moment to think to yourself, which of these 3 boxes would you put under assessment for learning? And which of these 3 boxes would you put under assessment of learning? There's 3 that are going to go under each side. I'd like to know, what are your thoughts? I agree with you, Gabby. The concept of formative and summative assessment is something I've been hearing about for a while, but these terms are a little bit newer. And I think I find these terms a little bit more helpful for me as the teacher, right? I think formative and summative assessment are helpful to think about, but these are even more helpful versions of that same thing that I think are easier for me to use in classroom moments. All righty, so I'm going to move these one by one so y'all can follow along. Well, one thing that helps me remember these is the spelling. Formative assessment is hopefully assessment for learning. If I'm stopping along the process of learning to take assessment snapshots, that's going to help me know if we're going in the right direction. If I'm on a hike and I stop every once in a while to check my GPS or check a map to make sure that I'm going in the right direction, that's one kind of formative assessment. And that's going to help my process of learning. Andrea, you have a question or a comment? What's going on?
Yes, sir. I have a question. Isn't it true that we need in all moments assessment? For me, assessment is always for learning, because if I notice that my students are not doing something well, I have to correct them in order to have a feedback, in order for them to learn.
Mhm.
That's why I think all the three types of assessments are going to be for learning.
Yeah.
I know that I can put them at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of the learning process, or the activities we are doing. But I think they are for learning in all moments. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I feel like I tend to hear teachers fall into two camps. Some teachers say assessment needs to happen all the time in every moment. And some teachers say, that's impossible. You can't do assessment in every single moment. There's not enough time. I think both of those perspectives are right. I think what they're doing is they're using this word assessment in slightly different ways. I think some teachers use the word assessment to mean formal assessment. I gave the students a rubric, they did a task, I gave every single student a graded number on how they did, right? Written formal assessment. I think that kind of assessment is impossible to do at every single moment. If every single moment of the classroom is measured and numbered and scored, it's always high stakes. My students are always afraid of making mistakes, and they're never going to make the mistakes that are necessary to learn to speak a language, right? So I do agree that it's impossible to do formal assessment at every moment. But I'm also with you, Andrea, that if I'm integrating informal assessment, right, where I give my students an activity and then I just listen to what they're saying and how they're doing, and I'm making notes and I decide what I want to do next based on what I hear, that's assessment too, right? And that's that formative assessment that I think makes assessment possible in all these moments. The assessment I do of observing, looking, listening, and thinking might not get written down in a grade book, but it is affecting the process of learning. So that's formative assessment that's during the learning process. And I find that typically that means I, as a teacher, have to be able to do it faster. I give my students 3 minutes to talk in small groups, and then I have 3 minutes. Well, actually 2 minutes, because the first minute is okay, get in the groups, get in the groups.
No.
2 minutes very quickly to try and go around and assess everyone. So I also find that the tools I use in these moments need to be faster tools so that I can really quickly make an observation and then come to some kind of conclusion. For me, assessment of learning is like the measuring we do, especially at the end of the year. I know on a system-wide level, there's a lot of times a push for final tests and evaluation, standardized testing. A lot of times that information is less about just your classroom and more to help our system of educators say, how are we meeting the needs of this whole country? Where can we keep growing as a system and process of education? And those kinds of end of process assessments are what I would call assessment of learning, right? The final measure after the learning process. Because these are more formal numbers, that's where I'm usually going to do my slow, very detailed assessment, right? So that's where using things like big rubrics and very detailed instruction sheets, that's where those kinds of assessment activities are going to fit in. An assessment of learning, right? Now, again, I'm not saying one of these is more important than the other. These are just different options on our menu. right? And as chefs, we want to know when are we going to prepare those and bring them to our students, right? So I think a healthy mix of all of these is important. But this helps me understand that when I'm during the learning process, the goal of assessment there is I want me to know where should we go next. And I want the students to know too, how am I doing? How am I progressing through this? When I think about that formative assessment for learning, it's a continuous process that motivates the learner and helps guide the student and teacher forward. So this is another one of the reasons why I really want in my classrooms for these moments to be informal. I find that when I do formal assessment, when I tell my students, this is a test, my students get nervous. Most of my students are not motivated and excited to take tests. And so if I'm doing formal assessment, that's not going to make the students keep wanting to go. And so if I say that during a lesson, I'm going to plan 3 moments of formative assessment, and every one of those moments is really formal and they go, oh, well, I'm stopping the process of learning, right? So one goal when I assess is this assessment needs to be fun, right? They're playing a competitive game. And as they're competing, that's when I'm secretly working on my checklist. For them, the activity is about winning the game. For me, the activity is I need 10 minutes to listen to which students are saying the words out loud and which students are not. So that might be me assessing something while my students are doing a different task, right? And I want to see what they can do. And I also want to help myself answer the question, what can we do next? If I listen to an activity, I say, okay, students, you're going to play charades in a group of 4 students. And I give them 5 minutes and they start playing charades with occupation vocabulary, community helpers, grade 3, unit 3. And then I'm going around and listening and I'm hearing, okay, most of my students are speaking most of the words, but they're speaking very, very slowly. And for 3 of the words, their pronunciation is a little bit off. If I hear that in that moment, I might think, okay, I know it's not in my plan, but the next activity I'm going to do a pronunciation activity. I'm going to do human computer, where I write all of these words on the board. I give them a number. My students show me a number, and then I say the word. And I'm just going to give them a lot of opportunities to hear me saying the word, because I think, the students are remembering the words, but they need to clarify the pronunciation. So in that moment, I give them a game. They're playing charades. I take a moment to observe the class and notice most of the students are mispronouncing these 3 words. That's going to help guide my next activity. And so when a moment of me observing the classroom starts guiding future learning while motivating the learners to keep learning, that's assessment for learning, right? So now I want to think about how we can use tools for these different types of assessment, right? We've thought about the why and the where and when. This is the what. What are we going to use to assess our students? What tools? So I've got another multiple choice question on the board in keeping with our theme of assessment. Which of these tools can we use for assessment? Whole class checklists, rubrics, individual checklists, observation notes, or all of the above? You've noticed that none of my other questions had the option all of the above, but now suddenly this question has all of the above. That's a good critical thinking way to figure out your teacher tricks and go, oh, it's going to be that one. I agree. All of these are different types of assessment tools, all right? So this next session isn't about which tools are good and which tools are bad. If I go into my closet and I pull out a hammer, a saw, a screwdriver, and a tape measure, none of those tools are inherently bad or good. What they are is designed to do different things. So I want to talk about all 4 of these tools and talk about the pros and the cons so that when it's time for me as a teacher to choose an assessment tool to help me collect information, I can choose the right tool for the job, right? For my speaking fast or my speaking slow. Now, the first tool I want to talk about is a whole class checklist. It looks something like you're seeing here on the right. I have the name of every student in a column, and then a lot of other columns where I might add in a check or a simple marking like a number or a basic, intermediate, advanced. So one version of this might be an attendance sheet. If you've ever kept a paper attendance sheet, that's a whole class checklist, right? Or if you have your students submit one homework assignment every day, and this is where you mark the weekly assignment. Danielle turned it in, Fabian turned it in, Ariel did not, right? So I think one of the pros of a tool like this is I can assess many students at once. If I'm assessing an activity and I know I'm only going to have 2 minutes, I need an assessment tool that's fast, right? If my students are just doing something very quickly and I want to gather some information, I might need to use a checklist because I can sit in the middle of the room and go, okay, these 3 students, yes, yes, no. She's saying it, he's not. I can do that very quickly. So the pro for me of using a checklist, like Gabby is sharing, is they're easy and fast. But just like Gabby shares in chat, Gabriela, the challenge here is there's not a lot of space for information. If I'm clever and plan ahead, I might be able to use a system like 1, 2, 3 or BIA to get a little bit more information, but I can't take a really exact measurement, right? So again, I think this tool works if I have a very short moment and the question I'm asking is a small question, right? Let's say, for instance, I'm teaching a class. My students are learning 5 vocabulary words for the first time today. And my objective on my lesson plan is students will be able to speak between 3 and 5 words in a role play activity. Well, I might at this point in time say, which students are speaking at least 3 different words? Now I'm getting more than just a basic yes or no, but by deciding exactly what that is, I can make a quick measure on my way towards my lesson objective. The next tool I want to talk about is a rubric. A rubric is like a checklist, but it's just for one person. Instead of having space for different people, it has space for different indicators, right? So along the sides of a rubric, I might be able to measure different things. Here's a classroom behavior rubric from one of my young learner classrooms where we were measuring, do these students clean up after themselves? Do they work well in small groups? Do they respect the personal space of others? Do they share toys and materials? And do they help their classmates? And then the categories of our rubric, our measures were not yet, sometimes, and often. So this rubric allowed us to be a little bit more expressive about this, right? When I'm working with young learners, usually it's not a student who's always sharing, right? But I might get someone who's sometimes sharing and sometimes often sharing. So this is going to give me more space for more information. For me, one of the cons is it's a lot slower to use. If I have all of my students in a coffee table-like setting, okay, U4, 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 all in small groups playing a game, and I've got 25 students, that means I have 25 rubrics. Now I've got my clipboard, 25 sheets of paper. I'm here, check, 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 flip, check, check. It's going to take me more time per student. Now that might be a good thing. Maybe it's the end of the year. I'm giving them a final speaking grade. It's an assignment worth a lot of points, and I really want to go slow. But the challenge then means I either have to assess learning on a stage where each student gets time to speak, but then all of my class spends a lot of time listening, or I need to give them a lot of chances for repetition. I might say, hey, I'm going to have you 10 work on a written test over here for 30 minutes. And I guess we're working in the 25 student class. Okay, you 12 are going to take this written test on this half of the room silently. You 12 are going to go into 3 groups of 4, and you're going to play this game for 15 minutes while I assess your speaking, right? So now I might have to start doing things like splitting the class up, half of the time speaking, half of the time writing, and then they switch, right? And that's going to give me more time to fill out a rubric for each student, right? Again, one way, one group of students on stage and everyone else listens. Another way, I could have half of the group at coffee tables practicing speaking, the other half of the class in the studio taking a written test, and then they switch. By doing that, I basically double the amount of time that I have to listen to students speak, right? And every student still has the same amount of time for the written test, but now I can take the time to fill out a rubric. Now, the other con I want to think about with a rubric, I think rubrics in primary school have a big catch. If your students know how to read, rubrics can be really helpful. If I'm having my students work on a project, I can give them the rubric at the very beginning. And every time their group meets, they can look at the rubric to help stay working towards the objective, right? The rubric can help guide them while they're learning. If my students cannot read, if you are working with an age of students who are pre-literate, then the rubric is just for you. Or, like the rubric you're seeing on the screen, maybe also something that was shared with parents. So the reason we did this was a very young learners program, 5, 6, and 7 years old. We wanted to be able to share this information with parents, and that's why you're seeing our rubric as bilingual. Now, I think if you need to share this assessment information with someone who can read, either a student who can read and the rubric is going to help them know what to do, or a parent who can read and the rubric is going to help them understand how their child is doing, then I think rubrics are very helpful. I think if your students can't read, you lose some of the power of the rubric. I'm not saying never use it then, but some of the power goes away. The rubric is just a tool for you to stay organized, right? So if my students can't read, I might not show them the rubric. I might just explain what I'm going to be listening for, right? The next tool I want to share with you, for me, is a little bit like a hybrid of the two of these. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but this is something, maybe you've done something similar, but I never found or read about this in the literature, right? I never saw a book that talked about this, but it was just something I ended up creating for a classroom I was in, and I found it really helpful. I started calling it an individual checklist. To me, this is kind of like a mix of a rubric with a checklist. So what I'm marking in each box is a very quick yes or no. But with this page, this individual checklist is for Itzel. And so on 11.6, I can come in and mark which of these skills is Itzel demonstrating in the classroom, right? Is she talking with teachers in structured time in Spanish? Is she talking with the teachers in structured time in English? Is she talking with her peers in structured time in English or Spanish? What languages is she using with whom in unstructured time? What specific language is she using? Now, to me, this lets me measure a lot of different things, but also lets me measure them very quickly. I found these very helpful because I had my clipboard and I could say, all right, I'm going to grab 3 individual checklists right now. Okay, I've got Itzel, Rafael, and Ingrid. And I walk around the classroom. I spend a few minutes watching Itzel, mark her checklist, a few minutes watching Ingrid, mark her checklist, a few minutes watching Rafael. Then I go back to my desk. Maybe I give new instructions and I switch out for 3 more individual checklists. To me, this hybrid approach is kind of like a fast, detailed way to do this, right? I could also design a worksheet and say, oh, I know my students work at the same table every day. So I'm going to design a checklist that has all 4 of these students who are at the same table. I'm going to have a checklist for each of them. And again, that means you can just dive in, observe one table, mark their individual checklists quickly, and then switch out checklists for the next table, right? Again, I might sound silly, but I think the logistics of not having to manage 25 rubrics, but being able to quickly rotate through sets, it made me way more able to collect data while also keeping up with 7-year-olds, right? Like I can only hold so many papers when I'm watching a room of 7-year-olds. At a certain point, if my hands become too full, they get out of control and I just have to throw everything up and chase them down. So again, it's kind of in the middle. If you find yourself saying, I don't think a checklist has enough details, but I don't want to take as much time as a rubric, I think something like this might be a nice hybrid. And again, it gives us evidence, right? We need some kind of evidence to send home. And so this might get me more evidence than just a whole class checklist, but not take as much time as a rubric does, right? So I might save the rubric for the summative assessments at the end, right? Those, oh, what's my new pronunciation word? Cotidiana. Those trabajos cotidianos. That's close-ish. I might save the rubrics for those, whereas I'm going to use individual checklists for the more formative assessments that are happening in the middle of the process of learning. The final thing I want to share with you all, I hope there's some feedback on the pronunciation. Daily work. Thank you for the translation. I also appreciate that. The last tool is one that I think we do most often, but I want to put a name on it so that we can think about making sure that we have a helpful process with this. To me, observation notes are anytime I'm looking at the classroom, thinking, and kind of talking to myself. Most of the observation and assessment I do is informal observation notes, right? At the end of the class, I pull out my phone, I open up my notes app where I plan my classes, and I spend the last 10 minutes just writing down ideas. What should we do tomorrow? I'm listening. What do I hear? What mistakes are they making? What are they doing correctly? Okay, let me plan a couple activities for tomorrow for review. That moment is a moment of observation notes, right? I think one big pro of this is the fastest and most natural process, right? So again, as you're working hard to keep up with your room full of young learners, having the fastest tool, there are going to be some moments when the only tool that fits is observation notes, right? And that's okay. I respect that challenge, and I know I've been in those moments too. So if you're feeling like, I want to assess this moment, but I'm never going to have time to do any of those fancy checklists, that's okay, right? Not every moment needs a checklist. It's not what I'm here to tell you. Now, the one thing I would say is, for me, the con of this is because they're the fastest and the easiest to do, I think they're also the easiest tool to use poorly. Now, if you look in this picture, the teacher here is not me. That's not me with long hair. That's my co-teacher, Maggie. When I was working at this school, working with these young learners, one of the things that really helped my observation notes be successful with is we shared the classroom. I taught on Monday and Tuesday, and she taught on Wednesday and Thursday. So on Tuesday night, I would send her a WhatsApp message telling her all about Monday and Tuesday. And on Friday afternoon, she'd send me a WhatsApp message telling me about Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Because she and I found the time to sit down and write down some of our notes, they never disappeared. So when it came time for me to submit some kind of feedback to an online platform for my supervisors or communicate feedback to parents, I had something written down somewhere. So that would be my advice to you is, if you find a moment where you only have time to take quick observation notes, you're not going to be able to use any kind of fancy checklist or anything. Make sure you still take the time to plan that moment, right? Write down a specific question for yourself. Even if you're just like, okay, aquí voy a observar y ver, voy a ver qué pasa. Write down a question to guide your curiosity. I'm going to observe to figure out how many students can speak these words by themselves with correct pronunciation, right? And then maybe in your phone, you just go around the class, you're saying, okay, who's answering? Who's pronouncing the words correctly? Who's pronouncing the words correctly? You're just smiling and thinking. You make a list of, okay, these are the 5 names from this half of the classroom. And as you're walking the other half of the classroom, I think the key moment is open up a note in your phone, get out a sheet of scratch paper or a Post-it note, and just really quickly write down those names, right? Take some kind of note somewhere, even if you just have a little journal for a class and you say, okay, at the end of every day, I'm just going to write in quick journal notes from my observation notes. If you write it down, you can start noticing patterns, right? And again, these kind of notebooks, you're just writing to you in the future. You don't need to write super detailed things. You can just go, speaking, pronunciation, good, name, right? These are just internal documents. So make them quick and for yourself.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
the question in the chat about having a resource like editable, that's going to be my new word, individual checklist templates.
I will keep looking for one. I was trying to find an editable version of my individual checklist, and so far I've only found the final PDFs. So hopefully this afternoon I can find an editable version, and when I do, if I do, I will upload it to a resource website.
Thanks. There are some places you can pay for some, but I always just use a grid myself. But I think it would be interesting if we could get, and I'm curious, I know there's some teachers out here on the webinar today. Laura Ugalde, I'm thinking about you, that you already have a ton of materials. I'm wondering if there are some teachers that already have some checklists that they use that could be shared. If so, please feel free to share in the chat. If you've got materials that you would like to share with other teachers here.
Thanks, Mary. I think that's a wonderful request. I'm with you in thinking that, especially with assessment, any pre-prepared materials, you're going to have to translate them into the context of your classroom. So I think if anyone else has any assessment checklists or rubrics that they've already been successfully using in their MEP classrooms, they might already be more readily lined up with indicators and fit into the kind of work that we're doing in our MEP classrooms.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
Hey, Laura, do you have assessment checklists? Can you unmute? You're mute.
Yeah, I got some. So as soon as I can, I am going to look for them and share them.
Great. And do you mind sharing your, I mean, do you still have amazing, you guys, I don't know how many of you know Laura Ugalde, but she has amazing materials. And
thank you.
let me spotlight you for a second, Lau. There we go.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah. So Laura has done a lot of interesting work with creating materials for the new curriculum. And maybe there's other people out there too, but I just happen to know Laura. So Laura, if you also want to share your contact information for people to reach you, please.
Yeah, I'm gonna write my phone number in order to get WhatsApps, so I can share some materials with all of you. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Laura. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
For letting me dive in there for a second.
Of course. Thanks, Laura. Laura, if you want to send the materials our way, we can also just upload them to the resource website. And then if anyone asks you, you can just send them that link, and then you don't have to send the same files a million times. So however it works best for you, we're happy to collaborate.
Okay. It's better, I think. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So the next thing I want to chalk with you all is show you the genesis of this individual checklist and rubric hybrid I've been showing off in the last couple of screenshots. This is the result of a challenging situation I was in as a teacher. I had just, with my co-teacher Maggie, opened up a brand new English Alive play school program in Cataplinkis. It was our first year. We'd been going since January. It was the middle of November, and our supervisor came up to us and said, I want to do final grades. It was the first time we'd ever talked about grading. And I looked at my co-teacher and I was like, okay. And we went back to our town where we lived together. And we're like, what are we going to do? We haven't been collecting grades this entire year. Like, we've just been doing formative assessment. That's all we thought we needed to do, right? This is the first time my supervisor ever said anything about grades. How are we going to do this, right? It didn't feel right to all of a sudden just invent grades, right? And I didn't want to just give students a final test after a year of this very formative assessment process. So the idea we eventually came up to is this hybrid you're seeing on the screen. We used an ongoing period of observational assessment over the course of 2 weeks during both the middle and the end of our school year. We started at the end of one school year, but then became a mid-year and end-year process. And this gave us a summative assessment, right? An end of the year snapshot that was also formative in nature. It wasn't just saying, here's how well this child can perform on this day, right? The final test is on Wednesday, and on Wednesday, Fabian performed this well. This gave students a big open window and said, how often can you demonstrate these skills inside of this window? So you can see that here on this rubric right here from Itzel, if we look at 11/6, November 6th, Itzel had a rough day. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, less than half of the skills, right? If that was assessment day and that's all Itzel got as her summative assessment, she's barely passing the year. Well, I know Itzel. Do you want to know the thing about Itzel? Itzel es una dormilona. On the weekends, Itzel would sleep in with her brother until like 10 or 11 in the afternoon. Not afternoon, in the morning, but like that's pretty late, right? Then she'd come to school during the weekdays at 7 a.m. November 6th was a Monday. So Itzel had just spent 2 days sleeping in until 10 o'clock. And then on Monday morning, her mom woke her up very early. And Itzel was very angry and very tired. And she told me. And that's why she didn't want to participate on Monday. So by measuring Itzel's performance over this 2-week period, instead of just saying, no, Itzel did not do this on test day, I could instead create this average and say, hey, during structured time, Itzel was often speaking with the teacher, but she was only speaking with her peers in structured time sometimes. And I could translate this ongoing formative observation into this summative rubric that was bilingual and designed to be shared with parents. And so by the end of it, by assessing the use of Spanish and English with both teachers and peers during structured and unstructured time, we were able to hear our learners' whole voices. Some of this assessment and these checklists, I carried them around the playground, right? I wanted to know which of our students are using English during break time. Which of these students are using English during snack time, right? And so this comes back to that idea of giving students different spaces to shine in as well. Because over this 2-week period, every day I went in, I just kept rotating. Okay, another 3 individual checklists, do a round of the classroom. Another 3 individual checklists, do a round of the classroom. And it created this ongoing process that could then be translated into summative assessment. Alrighty, the final topic I want to think about is combining last webinar's topic with this, which is assessment and ECRIF. If I think about the process of learning new language through the lenses of ECRIF, that In order to learn new language, learners have to encounter the language. They have some kind of contact with it. They have to clarify it, where they make some kind of simple decision about it. Then they start remembering it and being able to say the word all by itself. Then they internalize the word. They connect it to things that are personal and in their heart, and they start to speak in short chunks of language. And finally, they reach a level of fluent use, where they can use that language creatively, interactively, and spontaneously. If I see this as the process that all learners will go through in order to learn new language, my question is, where in this process does assessment fit? What do you all think? Where in this lesson, I have a sample lesson here. Again, it's about community helpers, grade 3, unit 3. So you can look through this sample lesson plan and ask yourself, where do you see moments that are accessible? Where, as a teacher, am I going to say, all right, in this moment, I want to figure out some kind of tool, either notes, checklist, rubric, or something else? Look at my accessible moment. What am I trying to assess? How am I going to capture the data? Where do you see moments for that in this lesson plan? Do you see any moments in this lesson plan that you would choose to assess? So I see a lot of different possibilities for assessment. I could see some assessment right here, 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 even here, right? I think in a lot of these points of transition from one activity to the next, I think they all make for great moments of assessment. Because again, ECRIF is describing the process of learning from the student point of view. So before I begin a remember activity, I need to know that most of my students can do this. If my students are still making mistakes with a clarify level activity, if I make everything more complicated, they're just going to make even more mistakes, right? I need to do some amount of assessment at some moments between these transitions so I can see, are students ready? Not maybe every student, but are most students ready to move on to the next step, right? If I'm in this clarify activity, I'm asking yes or no questions, and suddenly I think, all right, now around 75% of my class is answering the questions correct. Now I feel like, okay, I'm ready to move on. Because in my next activity, I'm going to have students working in small groups. And if 75% of my class is answering those yes/no questions, then I know every single group is going to have at least 1 or 2 students who can clarify. And those 1 or 2 students can maybe help the one student who can't yet, right? So by taking that moment for assessment and seeing, okay, 75% of my students are doing this correctly, now I know we're ready to move on to the next step. So now I want to talk and look and think about what those moments might look like. If we think about a moment of encountering new language, let's say I want students to hear community helper vocabulary for the first time and see some image cards. Can you think of any ideas of what we could do to assess new language here and assess speaking? How would you turn this into an accessible moment?
Matt, we've got a couple more uploads, one from Andrea,
Yeah.
one from Carolina.
I'm downloading them and make sure we have names on everything so I can share all your wonderful work. This is so exciting. I'm way more excited for you all to have these than the ones I made, because I think the one I made was very tailored towards my context and it was going to need a lot more work to get it to fit. So here's one of my ideas. One of the things I was talking about earlier that I really like to do is a little bit of pre-assessment. So some of you were sharing an idea of songs, right? And I might be able to sing a song and see which students are repeating. And that might give me one space. In a very even simpler way, if I'm going to show my students and like active or give them that encounter moment by showing them a picture card, before I show them a card and tell them what it is, I might do one round of saying, what is this? And then I listen. Can any of my students say farmer? Okay, what is this? Can any of my students say policeman? Maybe I print up these picture cards on a full-size sheet of paper, and on the back of a sheet of paper, I print a whole class checklist with all of my students' names. And so I hold up a sheet of paper and I say, what is this? And any student who says the word correctly, on the back of that picture card, I just put a little check next to their name. This might be a 2 or 3 minute activity right at the start of my class, but this pre-assessment is going to give me that measure to compare back to at the end, right? Now, I could also do this in the form of a guessing game, a song, pointing, matching, miming. But again, I think the closer this activity is to what they'll be doing at the end of the class, the more it's going to give you a pre and post assessment. How can you manage this kind of checklist with one of the students who misses school often? I would think, to me, that would be something I'd want to report, right? Like I know one of the things, and I don't know if this works exactly with your tech platform, but if I'm going through a checklist and I'm marking yes, no, for any student who's absent, I'll just write in an A and say they're absent. And I find that that is the safest way for me to communicate that to the parent. I can then send a check-in message to a parent at the end of the week and say, hi, I would really like to share with you how Diego's learning is going. I want you to know that over the last week, I had 10 accessible moments that I uploaded to our platform. But right now, Diego doesn't have a mark for 7 of those moments because he was absent. Because he's been absent for 3 of the days this week, I haven't been able to measure his learning on those 7 times. So I don't know exactly where he's at this week. And I'm also worried that he might be behind from meeting those dates, right? Again, I think now I'm documenting those absences. And instead of me communicating to a parent, Diego needs to come to school more, I can just say very objectively, Diego missed 7 of the last 10 assessed moments. How do I deal with students with cognitive challenges? I think we'll talk an idea about that later, but a lot of what I think about with this is, in assessment, I'm balancing 2 things. On the one hand, I want everything to be equitable. I want it to feel fair. In moments of assessment, if students feel like I have favorites or some students get the easy assessment, that's not going to feel fair, and it's going to create a lot of bad emotions, especially with young learners. So on the one hand, assessment needs to be fair and equitable. On the other hand, assessment needs to be flexible to match each learner and their learning. So I like to create multiple moments of assessment and let my student have the best score from any of them, right? So maybe if we assess the same thing twice, maybe they didn't do it well on this day because their anxiety kicked in and they weren't able to speak in front of the class. But if they could come in the next day and do it, I'm going to give them the highest score out of all of their scores, right? And so that might be a way for me to differentiate, give a student who has some kind of challenge speaking in front of peers more of a chance, but it still feels equitable and fair to everyone, right? Alrighty, next up, students are clarifying. They're answering simple questions about language, maybe yes, no questions, either or questions. The student might not be speaking the new words yet. They might still just be hearing the teacher say them, but they're making some kind of active decision about these words, doing a matching game or a categorizing, something like that. How could you create an accessible moment as students clarify language? Yes, no questions, Maritza shares. I'm with you. I think the structure of clarify activities really lend themselves to accessible moments. Here's my idea. Most of the time when I'm doing a clarify activity, I like to do an informal observation. The way I like to lay it out is, instead of thinking of my clarify activity as one activity, I like to think about it as 3 mini activities and create a mini scaffold. So first, I'm going to show my student one picture card and ask a yes or no question. Is this a police officer? And I'm going to listen to how many of my students say yes or no, right? And if one student responds first, yes, teacher, then I'm going to say, okay, Angelica thinks it's yes. Who agrees with Angelica? I want to hear everyone say yes or no. In this moment, I want to get everyone actively involved. So I start off with yes or no questions, and I do them with all of the different picture cards. And I keep doing yes or no questions until I notice that more than 75% of my students are doing it correctly, right? I'm not just going to go through the pictures once. I'm going to keep going through. I'm going to change the order. I'm going to go faster. But the question stays the same until I see a majority of my class doing the answer correctly. Then, okay, boom. In my head, I've noticed, okay, most of them are doing it. Now I change the activity slightly. I say, which one is a police officer? And my students go, or They're thinking about twice as many words. So as police officer, eso es bombero, fireman. Okay, eso, right? So to me, that gets a little bit harder. And now I keep doing these, showing a pair of cards and my students point. And I keep doing these activities until students cross that 75% threshold. And then finally, I give an either or question. I show one card and say, is this a police officer or a fireman? When I do that question, I'm challenging my student to repeat the word. They need to start pronouncing it here. That's why I want to make this activity third. And then when I see more than three-quarters of the class being able to go, is this a chef or a doctor? And I hear everyone go, doctor, doctor, doctor. Now I know, great. We're ready to go on to our remember activity. So again, I just use the same type of questions that I would call my clarify activity. The only thing I'm doing differently as assessment that I didn't tell you about last time is my decision of when do I go from one activity to the next? I go from one activity to the next when students are doing the simpler activity and most of them are getting it correct. And that's how I use observational assessment, informal observation, in a very direct way. Xenia adds that she likes to use yes/no sticks so she can see everyone answering. I think that's a great way to make sure that you're seeing what the whole class can do as an aggregate, right? Great. Now, how about moving on to remember? In a remember type activity, I'm trying to get my students to start speaking new words in single bursts, right? So if we're doing community helpers, this activity is going to challenge them to say, chef, doctor, police officer, bus driver. That's it, no longer sentences. So how could I create an accessible moment around that kind of speak? This is where I might start to use an individual checklist. My second remember activity was having students play charades in small groups. So I might say, okay, you're going to play charades for the next 10 minutes. And at the end of 10 minutes, I want to know which student in each group has the most points. Whoever has the most points after 10 minutes, you're getting 1 bonus point for today. I don't know, my kids like competition, so I'm going to give them a bonus point. While they're playing charades in their small groups, okay, I see this small group has 4 students. I grab the 4 individual checklists for them, right? Or maybe I pre-print one, I write some names on, and I'm going to go over and listen to their group, and I'm going to put a check for which students are saying which words out loud. If we're learning 5 new words, well then for my student to remember, they need to demonstrate that they can remember all 5 of those. So I want to measure, okay, did you say police officer? Did you say chef? Did you say doctor? So maybe for the first 3 minutes, I listen to 1 or 2 groups and I'm marking their individual checklists. Then I move on to the next 1 or 2 groups, then the next 1 or 2 groups, right? And I might have to do this activity on 2 different days. Maybe we play charades one day and I say, okay, great. We're going to do the same competition tomorrow. And then the next day, I get the second half of the individual checklists and I assess the other 4 tables in my classroom so that I've had a chance to listen to all of the students and say, which students can remember which words. One activity for segundo cycle. I can try, it's going to be hard. We have about 5 more minutes left of sharing. So I want to make sure we get through the last 2 activities. I know our ECRIF sample lesson that we were looking at is a sample lesson thinking around primer ciclo. So again, what I would say is if you're having trouble imagining this for segundo ciclo, I would go back and check the resources from the first primary webinar. That's where we talk about what ECRIF is, and ask yourself, where do you see students encountering, clarifying, and remembering language in your classroom? Where do you see them internalizing or fluently using? All right, on to that internalize activity. So I'm hearing in chat before, as we're sharing remember activities, some students like to do teachers like to do assessment around playing bingo. One of the things I'm thinking about with playing bingo is that might be a nice way to assess students' comprehension. Because in bingo, one person is the caller and everyone else is the listener, right? But in bingo, it might be harder to assess their speaking. When I'm playing charades,
Bingo. Bingo.
sí, Mylene, digo bingo. So when I'm playing bingo, only one person is speaking. That's the structure of the activity. And so that means it's going to be a harder moment to assess their speaking. It will be a great moment to assess their listening, but an activity like charades, where one student is silent and every other student in the group is trying to guess and say the word, that's going to be an activity that's really going to help me assess their speaking. So again, if I'm trying to assess individually, right? If I want to use individual assessments to check the speaking of 30 learners, I need to create 10 to 20 minutes of class time where they're speaking at a remember level. So they're doing some task where many students are being challenged to say one vocabulary word. And in meeting that challenge, I can make some observation around that and be marking that down. Right? So Ligia shares an idea like, who wants to be a millionaire? Again, if I'm trying to create a speaking assessment moment, I say, okay, my students like to play Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. How can I facilitate that in a way that's going to get many of them speaking? All right, what if I have them playing as a whole class and I show the question on the board and everyone has to say their answer before the timer is up, and then everyone who says the correct answer gets the point and stays standing, right? So again, I want to design an activity where many students are speaking at once, and that's going to give me the space I need to use an independent checklist. I think if I use an independent checklist or an individual checklist or a rubric, but I'm only having one student at a time, it's going to be very slow. Ligia is saying that's the way you do it. Great. I'm glad to know that's what you're doing. I was just adding on a few more words so that we could all think about how we're matching the assessment we're doing to the skill that students are practicing. Alrighty, for our last 2 slides, I'm going to just share with you my ideas. So in terms of internalize, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to try and create an extended period of time where students are speaking so that I can take turns assessing different students individually. Maybe I have students do inside circle, outside circle. So half of the class is in a tiny circle and the other half of the class is in a big circle around them. Students talk to a partner for a period of time and then they switch. Maybe in the first round, I have students spend 3 minutes to talk about 6 likes and dislikes. Then I have them switch partners and I give them the same challenge, talk about 6 likes and dislikes, but now you only have 2 minutes. And then I have them with a third partner and I give them the same challenge, 6 likes and dislikes, but now only 1 minute. This time, as I'm finishing internalizing, I'm seeing if my students are ready for fluent speech. Part of fluency is about being able to speak quickly. And so I might want to create an activity that's challenging students to speak fast and then assess how many of my students can speak quickly at what speed. Maybe then I create a whole class checklist, and for each student, I either write in a 1, 2, or a 3 for the fastest conversation in which they were able to complete all 6 likes and dislikes. Okay, talk to your partner. Both people have to share 6 likes and dislikes. When you finish, sit down, right? And so I see, okay, who can do it in 3 minutes? Okay, those are my students who can do it in 3. Who are the students who can also do it in 2 minutes? Okay, who are the students who can do it in 1 minute? And repeating that same conversation 3 times, faster and faster and faster, is also going to help my students move towards fluency. Remember, at the beginning of a lesson, your students are working on accuracy. They're working to speak very slowly and very correctly. For you to get them to make that switch and start speaking fluently, you've got to push them to start speaking quick, speaking interactively, in those same ways that certain contexts in our life, our friends, our hobbies, our passions, get us speaking quickly as well. The last activity I want to share with you all is an assessment moment that adds on to a fluently used activity. My idea is thinking about a spontaneous role play. And this comes back to another moment I was thinking about before of differentiation. For my role play at the end of the unit, I know I want to finish with a mini project, and let's say I want to do a role play. I might give my students 3 different opportunities. Maybe on Wednesday, I say, okay, today for the final 15 minutes, your group is going to practice and use one phone to record a video of your group doing the role play. And you're going to send me that video. And when you send me that video, everyone in your group gets 5, or you send me that video. Then on Thursday, okay, now today you're going to practice your role play, but 2 different groups are going to pair up and you're going to take turns performing for one group. Now I'm giving them a small stage. They have a tiny audience, but it's not the whole class. And then on Friday, I say, which groups want to volunteer to perform for the whole class? Which groups want me to play their video for the whole class? Now, I've assessed in 3 different ways. I've assessed in the studio, I've assessed in the coffee table, and I've assessed on stage. I could have one rubric designed for this role play, and afterwards, I could tell each student, I could say, I want you to decide, when do you think you did your best speaking? Was it in the video, in your partner performance, or in the role play? And then you use that moment as their final grade. Or you give them the highest score out of all 3 of those, right? Or maybe you just collect points off of the last one, but by building a sequence of assessment that leads up here, the process of preparation gives different students all kinds of different space to shine. Alrighty, everyone. I'd love to hear your questions, thoughts, or inspirations. I'm also going to do one more round of sharing our links. Please make sure that all 465 of you have filled out our registration form so we can report your attendance to MEP. We'd also love your ideas on the feedback form. Let us know what helped you learn and let us know what topics you want to learn more about so we can pass that information on to the advisors, and the next webinar series can be about topics that you want to learn more of. And if this is a topic you want to keep learning more about, check out our resource site. It's amazing. It's jam-packed full of articles and videos that continue exploring this process of assessing speaking. And also very soon, I will have those 3 examples that were shared in chat of some of your peers' assessment tools that they've been using to help keep up with the reporting duties of a MEP teacher. So if anyone has any questions, thoughts, or inspirations, feel free to share them now. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure connecting with you.
Thank you so much. I've gotten a number of comments about how useful and interesting it has been. So thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And I want to thank the teachers also that shared their resources and ideas, and thank everybody who has showed up. We actually have 540 on the attendance list, so it looks like we got a lot of people. We'd love to get your feedback. If you could also fill out the feedback, that would be great.
Yes, the
So-
reason that this series of webinars is talking about oral production and assessing oral skills is the last set of webinars. That's what teachers were asking for.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting at home going, why aren't we talking about reading? Reading is so hard. Get that feedback form. That's where, if you write it there, that's where you'll be heard. And I want you to be heard because your experiences and your desires are important to me. I know they're important to your students too.
And I want to thank the Ministry of Education. We had some regional advisors with us today. Thank you all so much. I know I saw Juan Carlos. Would somebody like to unmute and speak?
Excuse me. Thanks for sharing with us all these beautiful and excellent ideas. And I would like to receive the link for the resources page you told us, if it is possible.
The resource link is in the chat right now. It's the one that
Okay,
says
okay.
bit.ly I4CL MEP 2023. I'll share my
Perfect.
screen and show
Thanks.
you what that looks like too. If you click that link, it's going to take you to this screen, which is where the landing page for all of our webinars are. You can check out the webinars we've made for preschool and high school as well. This webinar is the second primary webinar. So if you click here, this is where you'll find today's slideshow, an attendance form, the webinar recording, and you'll also find all of the articles and videos. And I'm going to give you guys top booking. I'm going to put a new row right in here. And this is where I'm going to add the resources that have been shared from our MEP teachers. So your sample spreadsheets will go here. If anyone else has any other things you want to share with us, get in touch, send us an email. We'd happily share your resources throughout the MEP system. You can see how easy it is for us to broadcast things here. So thank you for sharing.